Background is nice, background.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in, first and foremostly. My name is Bagangweze, and I am a member of Ubumbo, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Women's Day webinar, where we'll be unpacking a very important and relevant topic today with three incredible women who will form part of our panel today, and I'll introduce them shortly. But just before I go there, a happy Women's Day to every woman watching. We honor you today, we celebrate you, and we hope that today has been a day filled with being spoiled and lots of reflections as well about the beauty that it is that we as women bring into this world. And to all the men watching, I hope that you've been honoring the women around you in your lives, and also taking this time to reflect on the role that you can play in the continued work that we need to do to ensure women's rights and equality in our society. So thank you once again for tuning in. And those of you who are not familiar with Ubumbo, this is the first time that you're joining us. Thank you so much. And in order to become part of the Ubumbo family, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to be notified when we have more of this content. And Ubumbo, very briefly, is an organization that initially started out as a sports institution that wanted to really catalyze transformation within the sports sector, specifically in rugby, which was very white dominated previously. However, the organization has very recently expanded its scope to really try to cultivate and inculcate a joint sense of community engagement around issues that affect the Black community, and really trying to bring us all together through the spirit of Ubuntu across all sectors, including sports and social issues and critical thinking. Ubumbo has just launched a website, www.ubumbo.org.za, that is probably available in the link in the comment section below, and you can check it out to see all the amazing activities that the organization has been up to, and check out our new Ubumbo Writers and Thought Leaders platform, where we feature pieces of poetry, prose, and op-eds around issues that are concerning the Black community in South Africa and across the continent in general. So before I speak too much, let me introduce you to our amazing guests who have agreed to join me today. The first guest that we have is Sis Nomboniso Gasa. Sis Nomboniso, would you like to say hello to everybody? Just a wave.
Hi.
So Sis Nomboniso is an adjunct faculty professor at the University of Cape Town School of Public Law. She's also a senior research associate at UCT and has done a lot of work focused around land, politics, gender, and cultural issues. She's also a feminist activist and essayist, and has written across a number of social issues, and has published work in academic journals and beyond. And so thank you, Sis Nomboniso, for joining us today. We look forward to having you. Awesome. Our next panelist is Nolundi Luayo. Nolundi is the director of LARC, and as a director, her role is to provide leadership to the strategic direction of the center. Nolundi's research interests also include women's rights and land customary law, and she holds an LLB and an LLM from the University of Cape Town. Hi, Nolundi.
Hi, Bakang. Hello, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us. And our final panelist is Owona Madlingozi, and she's also a fellow Ubumbo writer alongside me. And Owona is a public education and outreach officer at the Western Cape Provincial Parliament, and she holds an LLB from the University of Pretoria and social science degrees from Rose University. She is somebody who says she prioritizes joy in all aspects of her life. She loves cooking, and you can follow her her cooking activities and adventures on her Instagram account that we'll link below. I won't say it because I might just butcher the name. But thank you, Owona, for joining us.
Thank you, Bagan.
Fantastic. So diving right into the subject matter at hand today. we would like to discuss what we've termed as the state of women in 2020, triumphing in the tension. So we came up with this topic off the back of the commemoration and the history that belies the Women's Day celebration in South Africa. So we know that in 1956, thousands and thousands of women joined together to march upon the Union buildings in Pretoria to protest the act, which was essentially prohibiting South Africans from, especially Black South Africans, from moving from one area to the other, the Urban Areas Act. And in so doing, these women signed thousands of petitions. They held a silent protest against the Prime Minister to really try to fight for the rights of Black South Africans. And in so doing, also birthed the revolutionary song and what has now come to mark the women's struggle, or the fight for women's rights struggle, in Watinta Bafazi Watinti Mbogodo, which translated basically means you strike a woman, you strike a rock. And that was basically signifying the resilience of women and their commitment to really fighting for the rights of Black people in then apartheid South Africa. So the history of this day is such that in 1995, that march was recognized as a public holiday. And during this public holiday, what we do is we remember those women who so bravely marched upon the Union buildings. And then we also reflect on the issues that continue to affect us as women in South Africa and even more broadly across the African continent. And we reflect on the ways in which we've advanced as a society with respect to honoring and treating women equally, but also the ways in which we still need to advance and the work that still needs to be done to ensure that South Africa and Africa and the world as a whole really becomes a place where women can thrive in equal proportion to men. So without further ado, I'm going to pose the first question to you, Sis Nomboni. So just to paint the scene for us, and especially as somebody who has experience even as an activist in pre-free South Africa during the apartheid reign, to say, if you were asked what you see as the current state of women and women affairs in South Africa, how do you describe it, especially in the context of what those brave women in 1956 were fighting for? How do you feel that we've advanced as a society?
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for inviting me to this webinar. I think it's important to reflect a little about the National Women's Day, which is the introduction that you've already given. I think it's important to refamiliarize ourselves with what these women were actually protesting. It sounds so simple to say they were protesting against the past laws and they gathered in Pretoria. But before 1956, in 1954, in 1953, there were smaller marches that were organized to protest the past laws.
Yeah.
There was also the launch in 1954 of the Federation of South African Women. And that Federation of South African Women was the first platform in the country ever that brought women from different backgrounds, that brought women from the Transvaal and the Natal Indian organization.
Yeah.
That brought women from the Congress, that brought women from the Congress of Democrats, which was for an organization for white people, and African women. Yeah. That launch was not only ahead of its time, because ahead of, and I'm talking about Black women who are part of that now, it was ahead of the very National Congress, the organization that these women were fighting for. So the people were very anxious and nervous. ANC leadership did not support initially the formation of the Federation of South African Women.
Okay.
And it's important to reclaim this history, that women have never waited in this country for the permission of leaders, whether they were in the liberation movement or the state itself. It's important to also remember that in 1913, there was a march in the Free State in Bloemfontein, even before Bloemfontein was a city. It's important to remember that in 1874, Black women refused to carry forms of documentation because this thing of the past laws were always in the making, and they came in different forms, that the nationalist government, or even before it was the nationalist government, the various administrations, the white administrations that were in place, always wanted to have something, a form that would control the movement of Black people in this country. So as far back as the 1800s, African women said, no, we're not going to carry this thing. So that's why the 1956 march is so important, but it's important also in the context of so many years of struggle and so many decades of struggle. So here today, we're celebrating pioneers. We're celebrating pioneers who are ahead of even the men in their own liberation movement, that is the ANC. So the ANC came late to the party. They were nervous even about the 1956 march, right? Because there was these women, they assumed, right, that African women would be overwhelmed by especially white women from the Congress of Democrats and lose control. And these women were saying, listen, we know our story, we know what we want to do, and we're going to do it. So when I look today, I think first and foremost, it's important to recognize the strides that have been made in terms of the kind of legislation that is there, in terms of the quota systems that are there, in terms of even the rethinking of a whole range of things, including customary law, which is an impediment, as the Women's 1954 Charter says, to women's progress and development. So, but most importantly, today I want to celebrate the fact that women, and in this instance, Black women, have never waited for permission from anybody. So in terms of where we are, we see this also in our society right now. We see women being restless for change. We see them organizing and working on different platforms to ensure that this gender equality that we're talking about is not just a formal kind of arrangement policy, that it's actually substantial in terms of how people live. But we have a number of issues and a number of problems across. The first one, especially in this time of COVID pandemic, is poverty in this country. And we've got to talk about the way in which poverty inhibits people in general, and especially Black women, from living the full freedom that is guaranteed in the Constitution. The second one is of course the scourge of gender-based violence that we see in this country, and the particular forms in which it takes, particularly gruesome forms in which it takes, and the way in which women's bodies continue to be a battlefield. And this is something that makes it very, very difficult for me to speak, because I mean, the first time I wore a badge, women's bodies are not your battlefields, was in the 1980s. It was a gift from a Latin American feminist. So I think that maybe part of this, we need to be retrospective a bit and talk about why it is taking so long to actually address this problem. And part of that is that we need to think very deeply about what's happening in our communities. We need to think very deeply about the way Black women's progress, especially, is often seen as a threat to others, whether it's Black men, whether it's white and Black women. So we've got to talk about the ways in which women's bodies and this war that we have. But and it's not just women's bodies here, it's female infants, it's babies, it's girls, and we've got to try and again link it to a number of struggles that have gone before. That the stress of society, has always been visited on Black women, that we have had to carry the psychological, the physical, the emotional, the economic, everything. We have had to carry the stress of a brutal society. We have had to live in our very bodies with the toxicity of a patriarchal society that has had this racial categorization for oppression. For those of you who have read, for example, how African-American women have written about it also, this bridge I called My Back, all those kinds of books, I think it's important for us to look at this moment, what is happening in this time, and not be overwhelmed by the challenges that are happening. It's important to be in touch, of course, and feel terribly, I sometimes feel terribly exhausted. It's important to acknowledge those feelings, but it's important to also know that this moment has not just come on its own. It's a continuation of a systemic patriarchal society. So the violence that we see that is visited on Black or on women in general, in terms of gender-based violence, but also the violence that we see visited on women's bodies in terms of how the media covers instances of violence, that it is easy to have photographs of Black women disseminated. It is easy to have photographs of non-binary lesbian women, cut and coated. So, but of course, if you look at the reporting of violence for white women and all of that, you find that you don't quite see the women's bodies being projected. So we've got to talk about this thing, this entity that is the body of women in general, and this entity that is the body of Black women in particular. So when we talk about equality, we're not talking just about equality with men. And this is a very important point. We are not talking about the equality with men. Bell Hooks covers this very beautifully, and she says freedom, and she talks about the Black American South, where she grew up. She says freedom for Black women who were around her didn't mean equality with Black men, because none of us wanted to continue to live in the poverty and squalor. So it's very important that when we talk about equality, we're not just saying put a woman, put a man. That's important. The representation is very important. But we want to get into the substance. What kind of freedom is this? What kind of freedom is this? That every day there are reports of women being murdered. What kind of freedom is this? That the criminal justice system fails us every day. People call for death penalty as a deterrent, but they don't understand that we already have the most stringent, the very high sentences for rape in this country. But in order to sentence somebody for what they have done, you first have to investigate. You first have to prove the case. And that whole process before that, by the time it gets to court, if it does, has already been used. So when we today, what we are talking that have gone before us, when I think about what these women in 1956 did, when I think about the 1913, when I think about the women who came before us, I feel a deep sense of sadness in a way, because I think that for their struggles, for their sacrifices, for their courage and bravery, we should have a better society than we have. But it's important, I tell myself, to remember that the struggle continues, that even in this moment, new leaders like yourselves of society are emerging. New visions are emerging in terms of how we want to move with the struggle, and that new ways of thinking and new ways of doing are emerging. So despite the difficulties that we have, I actually feel incredibly inspired and very happy to be celebrating and honoring these women who have gone before us, because in the generation, particularly in the younger generation, I see reproduction of these heroes that we're celebrating.
Yes. Thank you so much for that, Sis Nobonisa. And there are so many golden gems that I picked up from that. I think I really enjoyed learning further about the history of women, that, as you say, we've never been the ones to wait for permission to fight for our rights or fight for a better society, right? And I think that's very important as we reflect upon where we are now, given everything that you listed and mentioned. But also like the balance that we're trying to strike in the title of the women's webinar, to be saying that, you know, there is some triumph, even though we are facing you know, the tensions that are apparent within society. So Nolondi, just with that, I mean, perhaps maybe you can give us your sense of how you feel we are, obviously being of a different generation than Sis Noboniso, and maybe also just speak into how perhaps you managed to fight, you know, that tension, to acknowledge the exhaustion or that comes with the territory of, you know, of being a Black woman and being an activist in the space and in your work, but how you balance that with still knowing that there's work to be done and keeping to move forward to do the work.
Sure, I can give it my best shot. I think that, you know, Nomboniso offers us a very, very useful starting point, right? I think that this important point about considering that struggle has both a past, present, and, you know, in truth, a future, right? Is a really useful framing to kick off the discussion, because I think what it does is it allows us to bear in mind that these moments are not isolated, right? These moments are, for all intents and purposes, both unique but also, sadly, somewhat familiar. And I think that there is both challenge and comfort in that, right? So the comfort for me is pretty much, as Nomboniso articulates it, it's in knowing that there are women, there are generations of women who have come before us, who have stood in similar and different looking positions, and who have somehow managed to make things different, right? And perhaps to varying degrees to make things better. But of course, there is simultaneously challenge, of course. And so Nomboniso's point a moment ago, you know, pitches that challenge very clearly, which is how much better are things? You know, how much different are they? And what has been done to build on what was done before. So I really think that thinking in a very holistic way about these moments in time, about struggle, about activism, and particularly about the work that is necessary to get by as Black women, and the work that's necessary to provide space to thrive as Black women. I think it's really crucial to click that into that overarching longer arc. And to click it into the broader narrative. Because as I say, I do think that there is certainly, and again, this is not unique to this moment in time, but there's always the possibility, you know, the reality of feeling quite isolated, of feeling quite tired, of feeling, you know, weary to the bone, I think, you know, kind of feeling like perhaps this moment is so detached, it isn't held by anything, that these problems are insurmountable, unique, and that they haven't been traversed before. And so that kind of comfort element is part of, I think, what I find really important in, you know, in try to do, knowing that, look, these aren't unique challenges. It's our time, it's our sort of opportunity this time to give it our best stab, to move the needle forward, but to recognize that, and I don't mean for this to come across as cynical, but I think to recognize that this is it's a continuum, right? It's a journey as opposed to kind of a destination bound trip. And so what you're doing, or at least what I try to do, is to draw from the knowledge that there were others who pushed to move the needle forward in the ways that they could at the time that they had and in the time that they had. And so the opportunity here in this moment is to do your bit, move the needle forward in the ways that you can, using the opportunities that you have. But I think to also acknowledge that there is that there is I think a comfort in knowing that as you kind of try to move the needle forward, you're also hopefully, working alongside those who will kind of take over and move the needle a little bit further forward when you step back. So I think that there is, for me, some comfort in thinking about these struggles as part of as part of a longer story that kind of casts its eye forward, and that draws comfort from the knowledge that we live in a country where there is an incredible array of passionate, intelligent, empathetic, committed, active human beings who are always willing to place themselves on the line, to place their bodies on the line, and to continue moving the needle forward. And so I find great comfort in kind of sitting, I think, with that balance, with that acknowledgement. That these are moments in time. Some of them are incredibly difficult moments in time, incredibly challenging moments. But that there is always this silver lining that rests for me in the knowledge that we pull together now, we do what we can, but we also place faith in those who will come after us, in that the continuing story can ultimately find positive moments.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And I love that perspective of, giving ourselves the space to acknowledge that, yes, it is exhausting, but that is part of a broader picture or broader perspective. And we're playing the long game and not necessarily just the short one of, small wins that may be very difficult to decipher from moment to moment, but recognizing that all our actions form part of the collective of the journey and the trajectory towards a better state for women in general. And Owen, I'm going to go over to you now, and maybe you can give your thoughts just around how you perceive the state of women, also as somebody who's of the current generation, but then maybe for you to just speak a little bit about how you view your personal leadership within the struggle, as well as the leadership role of our generation in moving us from where we currently are, honoring the work that has been done and charting the path forward.
First, I must apologize for this flickering, but we'll move forward.
Oh, good.
So, firstly, I think most importantly for me is that we were raised acknowledging the work of the women who came before us. I think, obviously, we were all in the system, and what happened is that we were always, the stories of men are always the priority. If you ask some to name the top 10 struggle heroes in South Africa, we even move to like the country globally, our top 10 struggle heroes in South Africa are men. Then we look nationally, we find out about the civil rights movement, and the heroes there are also men. And so it takes a concerted effort, it takes a very deliberate effort to be like, okay, who are these women? What were they doing? And what were they doing? And how do we honor them? And I think it's important because even myself, I only found out last year about what nobody spoke about, because the women's marches that happened before 1956, because 1956 was the culmination of years and years of activism. And so I always recognize, one, that it has taken women fighting in all their organizations, in their own internal spaces, in places where you're seeing or you're into space with the intention to make the same enemy, while we into the space, I think I'm fighting for racial equality. I think I'm fighting for removing apartheid. And I walk into that space, and then I'm seen as a subhuman or a subcategory of the people who are fighting against this enemy. And so I think it's just been necessary to be deliberate about learning about the women. I think that's what I was sort of raised to do, to be deliberate about learning about who these women were and what their voices were. On a Facebook post this past week, someone asked, who other than Winnie Mandela is your favorite woman in the struggle? My favorite struggle woman is Frances Bard, who I only found out about 5 years ago, because I moved to her street was called Frances Bard. I don't like not knowing who the people behind the street names are. And so but someone who was a trade unionist, who was fighting in different spaces across the country. And it shouldn't take my efforts to do that. I think we should be learning about that in university and schools in our history. The nature of our history needs to be more inclusive and so that we have a more holistic view actually of where we come from. We're not leaving when telling our own history and how we sort of overcome different struggles. And then as someone of this, it is the same thing. It's not just, for me, it's disappointing that I can speak to someone who was fighting who can say, yes, even in this movement, we were sidelined. And I can speak to someone in the 80s who will say, even they were sidelined. And I can speak to someone in the 90s who will say the exact same thing, and then I will come into and say the same thing. It recognizes that we're fighting for safety when we're fighting for other struggles. So I was in university when there was Roses for sort of around the country, and I was UP, so there was also there. And one of the stories that sort of it was painful for me to listen to was that in the midst of us financial relief to students, that the right to education that together, students were still fighting while fighting for these things. We're taking space, we're putting in buildings, even then we're being violated. For a greater good, we're being violated. And even then we push through and we're like, okay, you know what, this is an issue, we're going to deal with it, and at the same time we're so it's always that we are working 3 times as hard as they're working. And what the producer said is that women have never needed permission, but what women have needed, which is the struggle, women have always needed to do 3 things at the same time. So, to fight for what we deserve and what the world should be offering us. But at the same time, we must fight, people will fight alongside. To be heard, and then also what it costs them. Like my brothers are both my enemy and I'm working so many walls, and it's my struggle, and it's still my struggle today. And so I'm currently, I don't know if you know, in social media for the past weeks, there was fight back against private schools. Into a private school, and we've been in discussions with like dialogue with the schools and like now. And this alumni ranges from people who matriculated in 2016. And exactly the same. And the principal in 2017 is telling the same story of a girl who passed in 1990 when there were 4 Black girls in the school. And what it was showing me is that we're fighting, the struggle really does continue. But because when I was, 2 of us were loud enough to fight back against the school, and now we have these children who are young, they're 16, 17, and they're saying inside these institutions when very clearly you're told you are privileged to be here, you're so like the rest of saying, no, it's my right. I am welcome in the space, and this is a space for me, and you will treat me accordingly in the schools and their children. So what I'm seeing is, and what we hope, or what is the light at the end of the tunnel for me, is that young people are younger, and younger people are fighting harder, and they're fighting louder. And so it just means we're going from strength to strength. So if 56 marched, then the next generation is uproot laws. In the next return institutional norms. And you need to keep them out. But I really do draw inspiration and strength from the fact that we're moving, and I'm really grateful to witness.
Amazing. Thank you for those insights, Orna. And I think one thing that I really appreciated that you brought up is that is that the complexity of women's experiences whilst we are in the struggle, right? So we struggle for a particular cause, but at the same time, our men who we fight with, sometimes or a lot of the time we have to fight against as well, right? So I'll pose a question to you, Sis Nomboniso, to say, how would you say we go about navigating this tension that arises from the very same Black men that we fight with, on the sidelines within the struggle, but also we fight against? How do you navigate that layered experience and still keep with the cause, but also what is the charge for Black men and men in general in terms of joining us in the struggle?
I think that the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that there's tensions and contradictions that we experience in this moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, also continuation of the contradictory and nature of struggle and the complexities of struggle in general and South African struggle in this case. You know, today we talk about intersectionality, right?
Yeah.
How we have to acknowledge that women's struggle also is about race, it's about sexuality, it's about, you know, all these things. It's also about, you know, the liberation of society.
Yes.
And intersectionality is not new to us. You know, we've always done intersectionality. It was framed as triple oppression, for example, right? So that we are oppressed as a gender, as a race, and as a class. So it's important that sometimes we look at that. Because the tensions and the contradictions come as a result of how we all are located in our societies. And of course, as we continue to struggle, as we continue to think afresh of certain things, we also realize other forms of oppression. So in relation to, for example, I as a cis gender woman have got to recognize and think about the fact that I'm positioned differently from LGBTQI women and people, right? And that takes a lot of learning and unlearning, okay?
Definitely.
And unlearning the ways in which heterosexuality is dominant in society, and the way in which I'm a product of that, and probably a beneficiary of that as well. You understand?
Yes.
I don't have to explain my sexuality. You know, I don't have, as a cisgender person, I don't feel as threatened, you know, as non-binary people. Okay?
Yes.
So it's important that we have this conversation about continuous questioning of ourselves and the kinds of things that we take for granted, you know, for ourselves. So that conversation also has to include the way in which Black men, you know, don't have to explain themselves in certain kinds of platforms, right?
Yes.
So that part of the apartheid project was emasculation of Black men, you know, calling them boys and all of this.
Yeah.
So that's a real historical framework that we come from, okay? So they were also not only oppressed as Black people, but also as in a way that emasculated them. So we've got to have this conversation, therefore, that says we are together in the struggle, but these are the ways in which you, as part of a patriarchal society, these are the ways in which you are located that are different from us. So naturally, there is going to be a tension, okay? At critical moments in liberation struggle, there were times when women felt, well, we'll go alone, you know, and we'll go against you. 1913 March is that example. Black women were the first people to go to jail in the black community.
So
You hear me? For political reasons. Those African women, and you know, so we use black women in an inclusive sense of that time, Indian, colored, and African.
yes,
But it was African women who were jailed in Bloemfontein, right? When the only other people who were jailed were the Indian people in the Satyagraha movement that was led by Gandhi. Okay, so there were women there. So, and so I want to make this point. I cannot emphasize enough this point of memory and searching for women's struggle. So Nelson Mandela writes in the 1990s in Long Walk to Freedom. Okay, so he writes about the fear of the stigma of jail, right? That they really confronted when they decided they were going to go into the militant defiance and defiance campaign and all that. How they were afraid of the stigma. They were afraid of jail first, and they were afraid of the stigma of jail. And then he says one of the ways in which they overcome that stigma was looking at the 1913 Satyagraha movement, where Gandhi and where people in the Satyagraha movement were jailed. And they looked at that and they used that as a source of inspiration. Okay, he doesn't mention the women who were jailed in Bloemfontein. You understand? And I don't think it's intentional. You know, it's the invisibility of the struggle of women. You know, so you think that the most obvious example would be that our sisters had been in jail. You must read Solplaki on this. Our sisters had been in jail in the winter. People who know Bloemfontein is very cold. They didn't have, as Solplaki, you can see Solplaki was bougie. It says these African ladies didn't have their boots in winter, and they didn't have their coats out, and even talks about outer coats, overcoats. They didn't have their overcoats in winter, right? So, and there's a whole conversation, you know, in the unity movement at that time, or people later emerged as leading that. Solplaki and Dr. Abdul Baham, I think, there's a whole conversation about whether these women can cope with jail, right? And they go to jail, but we do not acknowledge. Years later, Mandela doesn't remember this, or you know what I'm saying? But he's not alone. The entire movement, all of us, you know, we don't. So it's important that we insist, we persist on women's experiences being honored and being remembered. And that's important in our conversation with Black men. To say, look, there are ways in which patriarchy benefits you, or in which patriarchy locates you in a place that is different from ours. In terms of the cultural practices, you must read the Women's Charter when they refer to the cultural practices. This is in the 1950s, and they say that these customs and practices would not continue if they didn't benefit our men. They call them our men, right? So you can see so when you talk about intersectionality, you can see the complexity of the location in society of Black men and Black women. So when we read in social media and all these things, when people complain about African women being feminists and being militant feminists at that, we've got to say, listen, we need to have a conversation. Firstly, it's important that you are our allies, okay? But you need to understand that the role of the ally is not to dictate the terms of the struggle, okay? So that's the first thing, you know? So that Black men need to understand that they are allies of the feminist struggle, okay? But they have to understand that in order to be allies, they have to think very carefully about their tendency to be dominant, which is offered by a patriarchal society. Secondly, we have to think about the cultural practices and customs that continue to privilege and men, Black men, and put Black women in very, very difficult situations. It's also important for us to think about the whole masculinity project in society. So how do we change? How do we change our notion, our understanding of manhood? What does manhood mean to us? And have these kinds of conversations. When I say conversations, they're not necessarily going to be comfortable or polite. We're going to have butting of heads, and that's okay. And I do believe that men can be feminists, and I, in my own life, I interact a lot with men who are feminists, okay? But even then, there are times when quiet and, it's sort of, the dominance of privilege now is coming, so it's important, to think about this. And I live with a white man, with a man of Jewish descent in South Africa. That's a white man, right? It's been more than 27 years, So there are certain things where I'm like, that's a Black experience. Tone it down, I can see the white man coming out now, So, and so what I'm saying is it's not a once-off thing, So you can be very conscious. I can be very conscious as a feminist. I can be, I can believe, that I don't have heterosexual prejudices. But once in a while, maybe it comes out, and it's important to be self-reflective. So that's what we are asking of Black men. This is my point of this whole thing. What we're asking of Black men is not something that we're not asking of ourselves.
Definitely.
Right? We are asking that we all become conscious of the ways in which we carry the contradictions and complexities of society, and the way in which we reproduce in our own personal lives, and the way in which sometimes when we feel we are in positions of power, that we actually act out. So it's important that Black men firstly recognize you're not asking for permission, and secondly, recognize that if we are going to be allies in building a society that is free of all these forms of oppression, we all interrogate our spaces and our roles in that. And and it's not an easy struggle. It's not an easy conversation. It's uncomfortable sometimes. It's contradictory sometimes, but it's necessary. It's necessary that we don't ask for permission. It's necessary that we continue, all of us, to think and rethink constantly what freedom means and redefine it. In the 1980s, when I was in the women's movement, I wasn't conscious, right, of LGBTQI issues. Okay. I don't think I was ever homophobic, but I do remember the moment of awakening for me was in 1989, right? When a lesbian I knew, right, ran to the Eastern Cape, and there were problems, okay, in terms of how people received her. So the fact that I remember the moment of awakening means that I was obviously not awake to the issues before times, right? So we need to look at sexism that we carry in us, the way in which we inhabit spaces that allow us privilege. So we've got to ask ourselves at all times. So that's what I think it's important for Black men. So, or for men in general, when people say men are trash, don't come and tell us that, not all of us, okay? We don't care about not all of us. What we're saying is that the system that is embodied in the kind of manhood that we have, in the kind of masculinity that we have, creates the conditions that we see in our society every day. It creates the conditions where women's bodies are basically seen as platforms where you can act out, whatever aggression that you have. So we've got to think about those, yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that insight, Sis Nomboniso. And I think that's something I personally relate with in my own activism journey, in that it's very hard to self-reflect and think of how you personally benefit from certain privileges that others who aren't located in your same demographic within society's hierarchy, let's say, how your own privileges also come across in rooms and spaces you inhabit. And I think that's definitely a lesson that we all kind of need to take the learning and the unlearning with respect to that. And so I think one of the issues as well that comes to mind as you're sharing this is that there's clearly an importance, right, for us to bring these issues of questioning the Masculinity Project, questioning how women's issues and our struggles don't really make it into the main narrative, whether it's in media or in academic writing, so to speak. So Nolundi, I want to chat to you perhaps just about what do you think the progress has been so far in terms of mainstreaming women's issues and let's say LGBTQI issues as well within academic writing, and how do we get it to the mainstream in academic writing, in media, this issue of intersectionality that we need to address, how we as well as how we learn and unlearn through the media that we have at our disposal.
So I think that's quite a large question, Bakang, but I'll take a stab at a part of it. I think that obviously scholarship of, if you will, scholarship at the periphery, right, of issues that have previously sat at the center, has come along in amazing strides, right? So there is obviously a wealth of incredible queer scholarship or scholarship that's related to queer identity. There's obviously an increasing body of scholarship around feminist scholarship, and academics who identify as being feminist academics, feminist scholars. So I think, as with a range of the challenges that we sit with, there is some progress. But I do think that one always kind of runs the risk of having even that progress sidelined, if you will, or at the very least perhaps relegated and sort of confined to particular parts of the academy, right? So, that work is of this particular type of discipline. Yes, no, it sits in that box. So I think what is an interesting question to think about is the extent to which we've managed to kind of cross disciplines when it comes to this work, right? So, of course, you take a look at your average university, and everybody expects all of this work to sit probably mostly in the humanities, right, in the human sciences. It would seem that that's kind of the appropriate for those elements and bodies of scholarship. But the question I think that we should be sitting with is, how much of that work are we managing to carry across into some of the previously more masculine identified subjects, right? Are we having these same kinds of conversations in the kind of the hard sciences, the maths, and how are we trying to create a more integrated, more transdisciplinary project when it comes to sort of diversifying how we engage with scholarly work. And so I think that, in that regard, I think that's an ongoing project. And I think it's a very important ongoing project because, of course, it requires of us, as Nomboniso was pointing out, to continuously be reflecting, right? To be reflecting as ourselves, but also to be interrogating the spaces within which we work. And I think that, there's an interesting kind of question for me that that raises this idea of how good are we at stretching this type of scholarly work outside of the usual confines into areas that have always perhaps previously been presented as somewhat protected, from this type of work. And it kind of speaks to, the point of Well, for the university and for the academic world to shift, I think, as a whole, there is certainly a need for a solidarity in the way that scholarship is done, right? And so for those who don't work in the kind of traditional realms where these conversations might feature or perhaps might be considered to live, there is an obligation, I think, and a responsibility to do what one can to open up that space within whatever discipline, whatever, realm of the scholarly world you're sitting, to bring that work into where it perhaps hasn't traditionally occupied. So I think that, of course, there's progress. There are remarkable scholars doing incredible work. But as I say, I'm intrigued by this question of how far and how well are we managing to extend that work outside of the supposed traditional homes that have been ascribed to it.
Fantastic. And Owen, I'm actually going to segue to you on that comment. As somebody who works within the public sector, within Cape Town as a public engagement specialist, do you see that transition or that application of the work of academia that's talking about and addressing these issues and informing policies actually translating into projects and programs and initiatives within the space, within, let's say, Parliament and the broader public sector in general? And if not, what do you think are the challenges and how do we tackle those?
I will try to answer the best I can. So what I think I have noticed is, and I've worked for a short time in my current role, is that it is not, we often have discussions about this, that there is the feminism of academia and there is the feminism of the world, not like the world, but of day-to-day interactions. To the point where we often are able to say, well, when people speak, they often say that their first encounter of feminism before they had a word for it was their grandmother acting in a certain way or their communities acting in a certain way and prioritizing certain teachings. So what I have identified now, where I work and with the communities I work with, and I don't necessarily think that it is a result of feminist work, but a result of this societal norm that is women doing the most work in lifting communities, women doing the most work in rearing children and protecting society. And what you find is that a lot of community-led organizations are women-led. A lot of community initiatives are women-led. A lot of society improvement programs are women-led. And so what I'm saying is that feeds how the provincial parliament and how some public sector initiatives respond to situations, and why you would then see more women leaders of community organizations and initiatives being present in committee meetings or being present in dialogues about how to improve communities or how to change community safety or how to guide children in being more active as participants in their schools, or how we tackle sort of multiple problems of getting kids off the street at the same time of understanding that poverty leads children into violence.
Yeah.
So I don't think it starts with the principle of feminism and then leads to us identifying women leaders who then become part of the dialogue which we have with them. I think it is the other way around, that we start with women and their role, which has always been leading societies but not been recognized for that leadership, and then them coming into spaces, because who else do you speak to? If I walk into Kanaland and I say, who here works with social issues? If I ask who here helps deal with breastfeeding moms, so what happens then is that my people I'm always led to, and I think this is possible for me because I work with communities, so I'm not working with structures and organizations. I'm not going to the city of Cape Town and asking them to give me a directory of leaders in communities. Going to communities, or going to community development workers, talk around communities and you're able to say, so who can you give me? But moving from that, what I think is that what I recognize now in the dealing with staff members who then go to deal with communities. So both of my seniors are male, but then our director is a woman. They are reading scholarship on feminism so that they might know how to interact with women in public spaces.
That's great.
They are reading scholarships that when they're trying to have a discussion on youth in the Western Cape or women in the Western Cape, they do not come, because they're both two very traditional men from traditional homes.
Yeah.
And so they try to learn, speak to young people, and how to speak to women and what the issues might be that they might not be aware of. And I think by them joining, they were able to ask questions and we were able to work together so that by the time we go to the director or by the time we go to the secretary or the speaker, we're able to say, okay, this is what we've come up with and these are the issues we think might come up. And I think scholarship is so important because it gives words to experience, and it gives me the language, right, to identify tactical behavior that I see.
Yeah.
The scholarship doesn't make this new, which I think is where a lot of the resistance to feminism and womanism comes from. Is that I remember we were in a book club many years ago, and there were these two young girls, and they were like, I'm black first before I'm woman, and I was like, tense. But then when I said, so I was like, why did you say that? And then, I mean, a lot of things came out, but one of the things that came out was that feminism was un-African. And I was like, okay. I was like, so can we try again? I was like, let's come back next week and I'm going to give you some books to read and then we can discuss those, which are African texts. But I think we have a lot of resistance, even from women who might post whatever political work they're exposed to, is that it's framed as this concept because of the term. So it's not that the understanding of what feminism is and what its work and its aim is to do, that we're trying to correct the mishaps of society and how they treat society and relegate members of the society to secondary citizens of society and the culture. And so because we're giving terms, people reject the term. They don't reject the notion because the notion has always been there. I don't think it is natural to assume that people are anti the progression. It's not natural. It's learned. It's learned with it's socialization. It's to be against the development of people, to be against the recognition of people, to be anti this functional society, because you cannot be a functional society, a functional culture, a functional anything where there are members in your space who are threatened in that space, not heard in that space. And so I think the academics are giving us the language to deal with what we already see in society. And because we have the language, when we then go to the higher ups, we're able to say, so this is the situation happening here, day-to-day trends. This is what it means academically, which means academically you put it into policy and then you can make the shift. But I think for me, it's always important that I start at what's happening on the ground and how are they articulating it and what are they identifying as the most prominent issues, so that by the time I am adding academic language to your reality for someone else to look at, I'm not making my academics the priority. I'm not making academics the loudest voice. I'm making this voice, and when necessary, in academic language on it, so that someone who needs academic language to move it forward can do so.
Incredible. I like that. And firstly, I'm very encouraged by hearing about your bosses who are reading feminist literature. I think more men should be doing that. But I also really like that concept of academia. One of the main things being about giving people language to truly express or even uncover, sometimes issues that have been plaguing them but they didn't really realize that there were real issues before. I can relate with my personal experience growing up in Botswana, where we didn't really have racial discrimination issues, and going to UCT and just basically going around my life like, oh, I don't know what, people are talking about racism, and then starting to read about, what institutional racism meant, and then being like, oh, this was me, this was my experience. So I think I can definitely relate to that. Sis Nomboni, so I'm going to come to you then. As somebody who has really been in the struggle and who's been doing the work for much longer than we have, I want to hear from you, and I think the audience would also benefit from just hearing how you get the fortitude to keep doing the work and to keep triumphing despite all of these issues that we've spoken about, the complexities that we've also uncovered in actually doing the work. How have you managed to keep triumphing?
I don't know about the triumphing part. Just before I answer that directly, let me just pick up on something that Oona said.
Sure.
I think for me, it's not academic versus community.
Mm-hmm.
If I think back to my, I think academics themselves are coming from society, right?
Yeah.
And if I think about queer academics like Melanie Judge, I think about Funeka Soldat, who's an activist in Cape Town, and many people who do work in that space. I think that there's a commitment to social justice, there's a commitment to a transformed society. So there's also a commitment in understanding exactly how do you change a heteronormative society.
Yeah.
Because actually a heteronormative society is harmful to all of us, but at different levels and with different, obviously, levels of intensity.
Yes.
So I think it's always important for me not to think about, I have the experience, I now need the academic to explain it. I think I'm a product of 1980s where we talked about universities changing the ivory tower nature of universities. So it's consciousness that is constant and continuous. I certainly had a stage in my own development where I thought I was Black first, I also had a stage where I felt I was woman first, and I still have those kind of situations where, depending on the issues I'm dealing with or depending on the space that I'm occupying, sometimes I feel, those kinds of different pulls. And the only way that I believe we can deal with it is, again, to reflect back on ourselves.
Yeah.
And think I am feeling particularly Black in this space now because I'm dealing with racism.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with, all those kinds of things. So all of our certain aspects of who we are gets emphasized at different stages, but we need to have this. I'm a firm believer on the continuation of the cerebral and the emotional. I don't feel that there should be dichotomy between those. But of course, it's a constant struggle. And in a way, that's also what sustains me. That's what makes me keep going, because every day there are new challenges. And it certainly is, and it has for me been sometimes. But in a way, those challenges also energize us. So you don't get to sit in a space of complacency. But one of the things that for me has been very important is to withdraw sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
You know, I used to write a lot about gender-based violence, articles and publish in newspapers. And then I got to a point where I thought, what is it that I can say now that I haven't said? You know, so I need to step back from the writing and the publishing and being the one who speaks to being the one who actually reflects and the one who actually tries to relearn, right? And I think it's important to withdraw from time to time, to reflect. One of the realities is also burnout. You know, I think we've felt it at different ways as activists, as people who work in particular spaces and work with very difficult issues. So I think being self-nurturing is very important. And you know, I'm very, very uncomfortable with self-care because it has become a term that is used by brands, you know, so we get fed all this stuff by that. So self-care is like is being equated to going to the spa, to a spa. Yes. It's being equated to all these kinds of things, which are good. They are good, you know. But I think that if I think back to the community of women and men that raised me in the village, you know, there were no spas, but there were moments of retreat.
Yeah.
Whether women doing washing together in the river, and then finding that to be the space where they could talk about, you know that stupid man who's in the mines. I hear he has a new family and all that. So it's important that we understand that we are not, as individuals, all on our own, isolated from others, going to change society. It's important that we build. Yesterday I talked about the importance of community. Yeah. It's very, very important that we find communities for ourselves. And I define community in a whole range of different ways. But it's important for me, it's important to know that I can call Mulundi and say, I'm very distressed by this thing that I'm seeing in the newspapers. What do you think? You know, so the individualistic nature that we see, even with feminist movements, you know, there's a lot of curation in social media and in media, where we start now no longer see ourselves as human beings, we see ourselves as brands. You know, it's important for me. It's important that I get in touch and I get reminded of my own humanity. You know, and that I'm not a brand. I don't want to be a brand. I don't want to be an influencer. You know, what I do want is to learn and live alongside others. So that community can be, it can be a brainstorming group. It can be, you know, a whole range of things. That's certainly what sustains me. Or sometimes I'll see an issue and feel incredibly incensed, you know, and really angry. Then I pick up a phone and talk to somebody, to someone, to a sister, a comrade, a friend, and say, did you see that article? Yes, I saw it. What do you think? And then feel their rage. Yeah. You know, connect with my own rage. So in a way, it says to me, you are not crazy. You know, you know, other people are enraged by this. Other people are upset by this. So in this incredibly individualistic way now, in which feminism is being made to be very fashionable kind of thing. So we are getting into the trap of thinking, I need to say this, I need to do this, I need to act in this way. So I think that actually gets us burned out, and that sometimes also gets us into unnecessary stresses. I think it's important to remember community, because the only way that you can change society is by working with society itself. So for me, what makes it possible for me to come back and say, well, you know, 25 years later, I'm still saying this. It's because I'm also listening to other people I've not heard before, to younger people. I'm reading, and community can also be made of authors that you read. It can be poets that you read. All these things for renewal. So where we go, it's like, you are equleni to the, to a river, to a source of water, and you drink sometimes, right? And you've got to understand that you need that. Because if you don't, you are going to be stressed all over the place. And it's always going to be me, I have to do this. Unless it's said by me, I can't support it. So it's important to be able to lead, but also to be led, to speak, but also to listen. And to be honest, I don't know how I have survived. I don't know how I do it. I don't know. But what I do know is that I, on my own, I have no hope. Whatever strength I have to share it with others. So share my strength with them and get strengthened by them as well.
That's lovely. I love the concept of the only way to change society is to actually involve society by being a part of society. And Nolumbi, I'll ask you a similar question, just in terms of living in the new sort of age of activism through social media and this wealth of information that we get through the internet. What are your key survival or fortitude tips in terms of remaining engaged, but also looking after yourself and making sure that you're not overwhelmed by what seems like an elephant-sized task?
So I think it probably is a case of what I'd probably sum up as about three things, right? So I think the first is to continue to hold on to what seems like a trite statement, but to continue to hold on to the knowledge that you can only walk your path, right? You can only walk the journey that is yours. And so, Normally makes the key point that in this kind of digital age, it's incredibly easy to fall into the comparative narrative, right? Oh my gosh, this their degree XYZ at the age of XYZ, what am I doing with my life? And so I think continuously kind of drawing yourself back to, no matter how much you might scroll through people's feeds and, have kind of FOMO and, get depressed about what you're doing with your life, you cannot walk their lives. You won't walk their path. You won't miraculously kind of become that person. And so to find a centering comfort in walking your path, and knowing that that's okay. I think the other is, the joy, of course, about the kind of digital age that we live in is that you do have control over what you consume. And I do think that is something that's important to remember. That you have control over what you consume and you have control over how much you consume. And again, it feels trite to say that, there is so much out there. Some of it is so incredibly mean and cruel and toxic and hard that it's absolutely pivotal to exercise that control from time to time, and to kind of exercise clear personal boundaries around what you will and won't consume, and how much of it you want to engage with. And then the last one, Bugging, I think is one that I'm kind of discovering, which I think is to drink kind of from both the well of vulnerability and the well of joy, right? And I place them alongside each other because I think it really, for me, is echoed in Nomboniso's point about community. But there is incredible kind of life-giving energy in finding and curating for yourself spaces in which you can be vulnerable, right? Whatever that might look like for you and whatever that vulnerability need is in that particular moment. And to also then create and draw from environments and communities where you can be joyful. And I don't put the two as kind of an either or, I think that they're intricately sitting alongside each other and intricately part of one another, but to recognize that there's that amazing Khalil Gibran piece, which I won't even try to recite because I'll butcher it, but where he kind of speaks about this complex relationship between joy and sorrow. And I think that, there is no point really in trying to pretend that one can create only joyful spaces or only kind of vulnerable sorrowful spaces, but to acknowledge that we live in a very complicated and complex world. We as human beings are incredibly complicated and complex, and that it's okay to draw on that complicated relationship between the joyful and the sorrowful, to move between spaces of vulnerability, spaces of joy, and to kind of weave for yourself something that can hold you as and when you need it to hold you in the ways that you need it to hold you. But that's sort of the points that I would offer.
That's incredible, Mulundi. And I really like that fact because I think a lot of the narratives that we're used to that have become social norms are that joy and sorrow or joy and struggle are two mutually exclusive things. And so that you can't hold both in two hands, but the truth of the complexity of our daily experience is that we can, and it really depends on the energy that you try to give to either or as you try to navigate and balance your life. And so, Owen, I'm going to ask you, as somebody who's really doing a lot of work around, discovering and exploring how to do the internal work, how to develop as a person, and also how to create and hold space for yourself as you navigate life's experiences. What are some tips that you rely on or you lean on as you embark on this work of being a female in spaces where females are, or being a woman in spaces where women are underrepresented? And how do you bring in that reflexive capability, but also that capability to know when you need to go and drink from a nourishing source, like Sis Nomboniso said, and where you can find your joy. Like Mulundi said, even despite the tensions that you have to navigate.
Yes, I think, and it's difficult. I don't want to pretend like it's easy to choose joy or to choose peace or to choose kindness. It is difficult and it is deliberate. My first thing is the daily rituals didn't work for me. I couldn't wake up at 5 o'clock every morning and say, I'm so thankful, God, for this day. Thank you for blessing me. So I remember people advise that they're like, just go to your day at 5 and like meditate. And it doesn't work because not every day do you want to wake up and meditate. But I started, my most important ritual for myself is that I find one good thing. I find one good thing every day. And whatever that one good thing is, that is the source for today. So firstly, I don't believe the word joy is not happiness. So I look for contentment so that my life could be falling apart and I'll be able to sit down and be like, life is still good. And it could be the highest of the highs and I could still sit down and me, Owen, as myself, outside of whatever accomplishment, outside of whatever moment, I can say I am good. And that is understanding that life will happen. And as soon as you have when you have identified your center, you'll still be able to sit with your center and say, this is still good. But that is still the thing. So I will find one good thing. My one good thing most is seeing a tree, or seeing a mountain, or seeing the ocean, or seeing a bird, like a bird just flew past the window, and I was really happy about it. I'm not sure why. But it is the one good thing that reminds me that, one, I'm not in control. And I think as soon as you realize that you're not in control, you stop trying. Like you can control what's going to happen when you walk out of your house. When you wake up, you have my day, but I am not in control of what the world is going to give me today. And so I can walk towards the day and how I walk through the day. And that is saying, I am kind and I am knowledgeable of what I am knowledgeable of. I am able to accept that I don't know everything, and I'm hopeful that today I will learn something new. And if I walk into every day and every situation, being able to say, okay, this is me, whatever I encounter, all of those things remain true. So I make sure that my voice, what I know to be true of myself, is the first thing I step into rooms with. So that you cannot lie to me about who I am. And you cannot lie to me about my feelings because they are the first things I acknowledge. And you cannot lie to me about my strengths because they are two the first things that I know of myself. And I will work on myself and I will work on making sure that those mistakes become lessons and I grow and move into them. But it is very deliberate work. And it is difficult. So, and the reason I say this is you can't lie about me. When I walk into spaces, I'm not welcome. When you're very clearly not welcome, where you are. And I like what Melissa said, what she said, I feel particularly like because I'm encountering racism. So you walk into a space, and for the most part, I feel like myself when I walk through the world. And you'll walk into a room, and all of a sudden you don't really feel yourself.
Yeah.
You don't take note of the fact that I am walking in the street and I'm wearing it, and and as soon as you start to experience those things, it is because whatever you have walked into has made you seem unusual in the space.
Yeah.
Has made you in the space. And then so you have to respond to it. But so what needs to happen is that you should not be fundamentally shaken by that experience, by that room that makes you feel unusual. And the only things that don't leave you there and not feel unusual, not be burdened by feeling unusual, is to be able to say, but I know that I am these things, and I know that I know these things, and you might be able to do things that I don't know. So if I walk into a space that is male dominated, it is just me. And I think also the struggle that I have sometimes encountered is I walk into male-dominated spaces, and I am they think I'm the, what do they like to call it? It's like, when you're ultra feminine and you look traditional, so they think you're going to fall into some sort of like traditional submissive
role.
And not fighting because you look like Umar and you just and that's the first that's the first step. Their first thought, and the resistance becomes even harder. So it was one of the welcome as a woman in this space if you act like a woman. Then as soon as you start to take charge, they're like, but Emma,
this woman though.
You're not qualified to be here. And you have to always remember that you might not know everything. So I'm walking in that room, you might very well know more than you in that subject. But I know that I know the 5 things that I know, and that I'm willing to, and I will speak with authority on the 5 things that I know, and you will listen when I speak on these 5 things that I know. And when you speak on them, I will take a step back. But I will also make sure I speak on the things that I know, you take a step back. And it is deliberate because it is unnatural to fight. It is easier to take time than it is to step forward.
And to conform.
And I really do think it's continuous work and it's deliberate work. This is how I walk into the world. And when do I recognize that it is time to take a break? I think first of all, I often say this, we're really great at giving advice. We're really great at saying, take a step back, relax, make sure you're healing yourself. And then we don't take the advice we give others. First thing is important is understanding what brings you peace. So for me, it is seeing the outside. I know I go a little stir crazy, and when I'm struggling and I am unable to sit somewhere where I can see the trees and the sky. And this is just because I was raised in a village. If I'm unable to go somewhere and see nature, whatever situation I'm in, it's 10 times worse than it is. Everything. And I remember, because I thought it was just nephew, he's very young, he's a teenager, and you don't think we're raised in the city. He was very frustrated with one of his uncles, and he looked at us. He was so angry, and he went to the crawl. So the crawl is the way the animals. But it's also where we have rituals that we to the ancestors. And he walked into the crawl and he started screaming at his grandmother. And he was just shouting and screaming, and then he just sat down. And he comes out and I'm like, oh, what's going on? And he's just like, no, you guys weren't listening. And all this because my grandmother wouldn't listen to me, so I went to her And so if your safe space is the crawl, if your safe space is sitting and looking at an ocean, if your safe space is silent, then you do that.
Yeah.
And I cook for myself. Sometimes I'll cook a meal for myself and I live alone, so it's unsustainable. But I will do something. And I will
Yeah.
make sure that I am the happiest person because of it.
Yeah.
And it will not be the same for everyone. And it might not even be the
Yeah.
same every time you need to sit. So sometimes your break is going to be you listening to bone thugs and dancing. Sometimes it is going to be you switching off everything and sitting in silence. And sometimes
Yeah.
it's feeling at a dead person because you don't understand why this burden is left with you.
Yeah.
I think just being really active in recognizing what you're going through and be
Yeah.
able to identify your feelings. Most can sit down and you can say, this is not sadness. This is frustration with the situation. And I'm frustrated because of how the situation turned out, because I thought it could have turned out better. And I think I would
Yeah.
have. And because of these things, what I need is to be reminded of who I am. And if to be reminded of who I am, I need to sit in silence, then I'll sit in silence. If to be reminded of who I am, I must write, then I will write. And if to be
Yeah.
reminded of who I am is to do something I did when I was a child, then I will do that.
Yeah.
And all of these things will, whatever ritual I have to do on that specific day in light of a certain circumstance, I will do it because I need always to come back to myself. Because I
Yeah.
can't know truths about myself that I said I knew if I am disturbed by the world to the point where it shift how I see myself and how I sit in my presence, in my own presence. And so I think that's really important just so that we can, so that when you the world, you're really interacting with yourself. So that
Yeah.
it really will come at you and will have you acting outside of yourself. We encounter so much trauma and there's so much pain and it's difficult and it is heavy and it weighs you down because you cannot ignore or hear a story or someone's trauma and not walk with it. You finish telling
Yeah.
me, I don't believe you told me the stating thing. And so it will story as I walk, as I go forward. And I need to be able to sit and say, you're still good. The world is, it seems like it's in flames, but it is still good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that, Orna. I think it's very insightful, and I love that you encapsulated with the fact that it is difficult and it has to be deliberate, but it really is but it's also something that you are in charge of, and nobody can define it for you. And I think that's so important, for the struggle. Also, what you said about being firm in who you are and what you know about yourself to be true, but also having the willingness and the openness at the same time to learn from others, and to get feedback from others, and interrogating that as well. So I think that's pretty great. And yeah, I think it really sums up the tips, I think, for triumphing on a personal level. And I think in my reflections just now, as we've all been speaking, we've been having this awesome conversation, I think I've moved over to maybe now conceptualizing the triumphing as something that is more internal work, and that when we triumph internally, knowing what our anchor is, knowing what really is important for the work that we have before us as women and men, that when we reach that level of triumphing, then that's when we are able to navigate the tensions well. We're able to have fortitude to continue to do the work. And so I think I'm very encouraged by that. And with that, we are almost at, we're actually a few minutes over time, but I'd like to give each one of our panelists just a moment to give a parting thought and a charge for our audience, in terms of anything that you think we as young people or whoever's watching should take forward in doing the work, or what you like our society to look like in terms of the responsibility we take in really fighting for the equality and just treatment of women in our society. Sis Nombonisa, I'll give you the floor first.
I think the first thing that is important for me that I would like to share is taking notice, being fully present in an experience, to take notice, to be aware of your own response to things, to be aware of what is around you, and to be aware of possibilities. We have so many things coming at us, information, experiences, video clips of violence and police, all these kinds of things that we don't give ourselves a moment to notice. And for me, what has served me has been this awareness of how things affect me. Whether it is about writing, whether it's about feministing, whether it's about activism, I believe that I'm not able to do any of those things until I'm able to check in with myself and write or respond or act from a space of conviction. So for me, that's very, very important. It's also very important to look at who's around me, because we get into spaces where I'm the only one who does this. So about 5 years ago, I decided I will not get into panels where I'm the only woman. I will not get into panels where I'm the only Black person. For me, it's important to look at who is around me, with whom am I matching now, with whom am I in conversation. So that's and I could only get to that when I actually started to notice, and I thought, I don't actually like being the only woman in a panel. I don't actually like being the only Black person in a space where everybody should be invited. So because I insist on those things, so I have had to accept the fact that I won't be invited, or I will walk away from what appears to be an interesting conversation. But often it has also had the positive impact where people say, oh, we didn't think about it. So can you advise us on who else to get? So whatever it is that you feel strongly about, give yourself time to notice.
That's so good. Thank you, Sis Nomboniso. Nolundi?
I think I'd probably just leave people with two things, I guess. The one is that even the small things can make a difference, right? And so find the small needs, find the small gaps, find the seemingly small conversations, have them, start the conversation, address the need as best you can. Find the ways that may not feel like they are, mountains, but rather than mustard seeds. But those count too. So I would say find the mustard seeds, because the small things can. And then the last point is really just, I think, we're living in, difficult doesn't really quite begin to encompass the times that we're living in, but we're living in, possibly some of the most trying times that many of us have ever lived through. And so really, I think that, that refrain, that's currently a Harry Styles song, whoever thought I'd quote Harry Styles, but to treat people with kindness, to just move through the world with a warmth of heart, a generosity of spirit, a kind of a quiet recognition that people are going through stuff, and the people on kind of the other end of these, laptop cameras that we're looking through, who are going through stuff, it really will be okay. It will be okay, and then if you need help, find somebody, someone to hold your hand through it, but move with kindness as much as you can.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Nolundi. And last but not least, Owona.
Yes, Makana. I think my parting comments, You see that what Nalodi said, for me, it's just that do one thing. I think it's easy to be overwhelmed. I think, one, we're in a pandemic, and I keep saying this like every couple of days because it doesn't quite hit me that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And you think of the Spanish flu, I'm like, oh, that was a really big bad thing. We're in the middle of the Spanish flu. And beyond that, the pandemic, and I said this to someone before, that the pandemic isn't even the biggest issue for a lot of people.
Yeah.
There's still inequalities, there's still poverty, there's still violence.
Yeah.
And so in light of all of it, you can wake up and you can be overwhelmed and say, no matter what I do, I can change anything. So do one thing and change one or change one person's experience. If you do something and one person never doubts themselves again, you have achieved the best thing you could have. If you do something and when people walk to a coffee shop in Albany Road, they never encounter sexual harassment in that Albany Road, you have done brilliant work. Whatever is the one thing, and if you don't have to change the world, but we should all try to change one thing so that the experience of the next person in that space is control over, or the way that we have control. Never have to experience this thing that we have been able to feed. And I think that is just the most important thing, change one thing. And
yeah,
I think it's just choose one thing and ensure that one thing that is, make sure that no one is in that space again.
Amazing, incredible. Thank you for that, Owana. And just thank you to all of my panelists. I think you guys really were open to us today, vulnerable as well, which is something that I really appreciate. And I'm sure that it's impacted our audience just as much as it's impacted me. And we have a lot of comments coming in from the chat on YouTube, where everybody's really just appreciating the discussion. They've learned a lot from it and feel like it's a very important discussion. And so I really want to thank each and every one of you for making the time to be part of this really important and impactful conversation. And to the audience that has tuned in, thank you so much for joining in on this conversation. And we hope that you can carry this conversation forth in your spaces and the lessons as well that you've learned, as you've heard from our panelists. Just take note of everything around you, check in with yourself, do one small thing, and the small things really matter, and just move around the world with kindness. And that, it's the little things and the small steps that beget the bigger steps. And so I really hope that we can all leave this conversation impacted and truthfully changed to then go and change whatever surroundings we find ourselves in. Thank you to Lani from Ilalini, who is our technical behind-the-scenes expert, and he's made all of this amazing stuff possible within a very short space of time. I initially had a very hectic panic attack when the team from Ubumbo suggested this. I was like, there is no way, but they have made a way, so I'm really grateful that we've been able to engage here. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Women's Day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Ode to the Woman. Ode to the woman who wakes up every morning, puts a smile on her face and musters the courage to seize the day. To the selfless woman who does it for her family, who always finds a way. To the woman who's a savior, whose desire is to guide and be cherished, but instead suffers crucifixion at the hands of an angered man. whose biggest sin is femininity and greatest weakness is her greatest strength, that which lies in between her thighs, that gives a man his greatest high and gives birth to a precious life. To the woman who labored through hours of agonizing contractions to deliver the fruit of her womb so that the human race may bloom. To the woman who makes daily sacrifices, who puts the happiness of her loved ones before her own, whose arms provide a haven for cries and a home, yet her sorrows echo unnoticed when she's alone. To the woman turning rags to riches, sealing her agony with stitches while trying to look good for pictures, because at the end of the day, without her body, she's seen as a mere fixture. To the woman who's a fighter, the woman who lifts her family higher, to the woman whose image we see when we think of a role model, the woman who is not defined by societal standards but who has built herself her own pedestal. To the woman who's a visionary, who despite living life constantly weary manages to find her light and keep her head high. To the woman who protects while her soul remains exposed, to the woman who dries tears while pushing back her own and battling her fears. To the woman who gives warmth while her back suffers the consequence of the world's scorn. To the woman who gives life just for hers to be taken away by a single strike. To the woman whose love is infinite yet she gets stripped of it. To the woman whose cries echo in every dark corner. To the woman who have felt the taste of hell before they've experienced death. To the woman who, concerning their body, have little say. To the woman whose lights have been forced off. To the woman who have ignited their own flames. To the women who feel, who cry, who fight, who try. Ode to the woman.